Remember we play? Remember Wii Tanks? Yeah, you do. Except you're wrong. What you're seeing right now on screen is my remake of Wii Tanks I made using Unreal Engine 5. Here is how I made it. Before I begin, I need to preface something. I am by no means an expert in Unreal Engine 5, so if you notice any unoptimizations or any funky logic, that's why. I used mostly blueprints to create the project, but I did write some C++ functions when I needed to make some more complex calculations. So with that out of the way, let's begin. Yeah, I found the rape models and other assets online. With the assets in hand, it was time for the first step in remaking Wii Tanks, the player controls. If you recall from the original game mode, the player can move around in any direction, fire up to 5 shells at a time, and place down a singular mine. The first mechanic I would tackle was movement. It should have been a pretty simple to implement, right? See these? Notice how the tank does not need to rotate 180 degrees when it wants to go the opposite way. Normally in Unreal Engine, you can set your pawn facing that direction it is moving, but that's not how a tank works. I had to figure out a way for the tank to calculate whether rotating clockwise was faster than rotating anti-clockwise in order for the tank to be parallel to its movement vector. First, I calculated the forward and backward vectors of the tank itself. Then I calculated the angles between the movement vector and the backward and forward vectors. Then rotate the tank clockwise or anti-clockwise depending on which is the shorter angle. This only took me 1 week to figure out. Wow. Once that was out of the way, I implemented the other mechanics missing. I created a shell actor that spawns when you left click on the mouse. If it collides with a wall, it will be reflected in the appropriate angle. The player can place down a mine pressing E. You can actually destroy yourself with your own mine and shell, just like in the original game mode. Just to make my implementation a little more original, I added different fire modes to the player tank. Pressing the right click allows you to rapid fire 3 shells at once, at the cost of accuracy, and pressing Q allows you to shoot a singular fast moving shell, like some of the enemies that appear in later levels. After finishing with the player mechanics, it was time to implement the enemies, starting with the brown. So the brown tank is the first enemy you encounter. It's not really meant to be a threat to the player because it's kinda like the tutorial enemy. This tank just kinda... The grey or ash tank is the first real threat the player will encounter. Since this one actually moves around and targets the player, it was time to implement some proper AI. For that purpose, I used a behavior tree. To move around, the enemy runs an environmental query system, or EQS, to pick a random point around the player to move towards. To fire, it first checks if the player is within sight via a line trace. I also made it so if the player's shell gets too close, the tank will actually try to dodge it. Pretty cool. Since different color tanks behave differently, I had to edit this behavior tree to accommodate the other behaviors. For example, the yellow tank places mines instead of firing at the player. The marine tank tries to stay as far away from the player as possible, while the pink tank tries to get all up in the player's face. The green tank was the trickiest to implement. In the original game mode, it uses calculated, predictive aiming and tends to fire where the player is approaching rather than their current position, being able to do so with such calculation accounting for its 2 ricochet. Basically what I did was make 3 line traces total, 2 for each ricochet. If the player overlaps with any of the line traces, the tank will fire. I used a transparent material that faded at the start of the level. I didn't implement this one. To keep the scope of this project small, I decided I would only remake the first 20 levels of the original game mode. I'm not a big fan of Unreal's level editor, so I used Blender to create the levels, export them as FBXs and then import them back into the level. If you're familiar with Wii Tanks, you know that it has a surprisingly complex music system. In brief, the more dangerous the tank present in the level, the more intense the music gets. The music will actually change dynamically throughout the level depending on what tanks remain alive. Now, at first I had no idea how to implement this feature. There was no way I was implementing dynamic audio for this project. I simply did not have the expertise to implement it. But after searching around on YouTube, I discovered a way to brute force it. I downloaded every possible variant of the music track and put it into the project. Then I made it so every single one of these tracks is played at the same time, all 23 of them, but with their volume set to 0. Afterwards, I checked to see which of the tanks present in the current level was of the highest danger level. Depending on what tank that was, the appropriate music is played. This check is made every time a tank is destroyed in the level. Here's how the process looks in the level blueprint. After that, it was just a matter of polishing up the game. I added sound effects, visual effects, added destructible blocks, changed the cursor, spawned little X decals when a tank is destroyed, and lastly added UI and the main menu that lets you select the cursor and color of your tank. And that's how I remade Wii Tanks on Unreal Engine. I'm very proud of how this project turned out. I had a ton of fun working on it, and I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making it. I'm going to be sharing more game development stuff on this channel, so be sure to subscribe if you're interested in that. Thank you for watching this video and goodbye.